I'm going to Leicester for 1 day only to see some very, very exciting documents. This is the Leicestershire County Record Office. It holds the archives of Thomas Cook Travel Agency. This company was founded here in Leicestershire in 1841. Thomas Cook operated for nearly 2 centuries. Before its bankruptcy in 2019, it was one of the world's biggest tour operators. In fact, it was Cook who invented tourism as we know it. With Cook, you could go anywhere. Absolutely anywhere. I arranged a visit to the Leicestershire archives to see how trips to Germany were organized and advertised after 1933, once the National Socialists had come to power. What became clear very quickly was this: they were organized beautifully and advertised colorfully, even considering the circumstances. Here's a cheerful map of Germany, accompanied by a slogan about national rebirth and how the National Socialist government is awakening the full strength of the people. Here is a blurb about a new holiday, Labor Day, established on the initiative of Dr. Goebbels. Here's one about the wonderful Autobahns, a project under the personal supervision of Führer Adolf Hitler. There's even a 1938 travel brochure decked out in that unmistakable style. It's not something you usually think about, but it makes sense. You could just go to the Third Reich as a tourist and maybe even have a pretty decent time. And so I decided to take my own little trip. I'm flying to Berlin, this is my boarding pass, and I want to imagine what it would be like if it were not spring 2025, but spring 1936. What kind of impressions would I bring from the Third Reich? How would I behave just as an ordinary tourist? Where would I exchange money? Where would I go to celebrate my visit? Where would I eat? Where would I drink? Which exhibitions would I see at the museum? Which shows would I catch at the theater? What would I chat about with the locals? And afterwards, how would I describe what I had seen? Something like,
I really enjoyed it. And all that other stuff. Well, you know, I didn't notice anything. Well, the streets are clean, taxis are cheap, restaurants are full, people are nice.
So, what would I have seen in that pre-war Nazi Berlin? And more importantly, what would I have noticed? Well, maybe, just maybe, I would have spotted something they really didn't want me to see. After World War II, with the meticulous documentation of Nazi horrors, the war crimes trials, and the endlessly repeated mantra, never again, we must never forget, we must learn from history, it starts to feel as though Germany in 1933 simply vanished into a black hole. 1 minute there was a country, the next, he who must be named came to power and poof, nothing but one giant concentration camp. But that's not what happened at all. In 1930s Germany, life went on. People still drank beer, hotel sheets were still tucked in, music at concerts still played, and what's more, the Nazis, having come to power in January 1933, worked hard to maintain or even recreate a sense of normality. Just a few months after Hitler became Chancellor, the Reich Committee of Tourism was founded. Its job? Not merely to ensure tourists were not afraid of visiting Germany, but to make them eager, curious, even enthusiastic about coming to a country on the brink of great change. Change for the better, of course. This is Berlin-Brandenburg Airport. It's only 5 years old, so it's a new one. But back in the day, the guests of the Reich arrived somewhere else. Right this way, under the eagle's head. This statue stood on the roof of old Tempelhof airport. It was once built on the site of old Prussian military ground. They loved that stuff, so the size of the ground is roughly of the size of Monaco. By the 1930s, Tempelhof was one of the major airports in Europe. 200,000 passengers flew in here annually. People came here just to hang out. For a small fee, you could enter the airport, sit in a cafe, eat or drink something, and see the roaring aircrafts taking off and land. So this is the runway. And this is the airfield. And since you had so much space, and if planes were not quite your thing, you had always another kind of machinery. The Nazis used the Tempelhof airfield for all sorts of parades, marches, and ceremonial fanfare. As of 1936, tourists are pouring into the Reich. The tourist board is rubbing its hands, and the new colossal building is being built at Tempelhof. This is the new airport, a very cheerful building with bars on the windows. This airport is designed to handle not 200,000 passengers a year, but as this grand project was underway, with the old building of the airport still operating and the cafe working and offering this lovely view of the planes, there was still something else happening on the ground. Right after coming to power, the Nazis set a concentration camp at Tempelhof. It was named Columbia. It's a local toponym. It is still used in the area. KC Columbia was operated by the Gestapo and then by the SS. It was very famous for its brutality and systematic torture. But what's more symbolic is who was held in one and only concentration camp in Berlin. Leftist intellectuals, artists, gay people, trans people, all those who made Berlin famous in the first place.
Before 1933, Berlin was Europe's most progressive, most independent, most unhinged city. Nightclubs, gay parties, cabarets, performance art, expressionist painters, fashionable music, wild experiments, freedom in full swing. It was loud, messy, glorious, and it all ended very quickly, right after the winter elections of 1933. So what happened to the city? That's what we're going to find out.
So I'm taking an S-Bahn from the airport to the city center. Running a train line out of the airport seems like a quite modern concept. But actually, if it were 1936 and I were leaving the Tempelhof airport, it would be a train too, because Tempelhof was the first airport to have an underground connection to the city center. If I were scooping up the creme de la creme of 1930s Berlin, there is no doubt where I'd stay. Here, at the Hotel Adlon. This building is actually a reconstruction, or rather a total do-over. Before the war, the hotel looked like this. The Adlon was the most respectable hotel among high-profile tourists. Real old school, built in imperial times. When the draft in the Kaiser Palace got especially nippy in winter, Kaiser Wilhelm would move in here. This was also a temporary home for India Maharaja, Russian Tsar Nicholas II, and then, after the World War I, all A-listers, Charlie Chaplin, Albert Einstein, Marlene Dietrich, and so on. Then came the Nazis, and the Adlon family that owned the hotel decided to bet on new stars. They really wanted to organize chic events like party congresses or SS board meetings. For some reason, though, the National Socialists preferred the Kaiserhof just round the corner. It was also bombed during the war. But still, who might we bump into if we checked into Adlon in 1936? Let's head inside and find out. Just a reminder, there is nothing original left, but still you can't just blow history away with a hairdryer. So who might you bump into when checking in here? So, for starters, how about Nobel Prize winner and Norwegian writer Knut Hamsun? Not only did he support the Nazis, he also sent his children to Germany.
His daughter Cecilia and his son Tore. And Tore went the extra mile. He joined the SS.
Or take this young lady, Unity Mitford, a British aristocrat and socialite and a low-key Hitler groupie. She was so devoted. She moved from England to Germany in 1934 and spent 10 months stalking Hitler in his favorite cafe in Munich. Eventually, he noticed her, invited to the table, and this was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Here is a photo of Unity Mitford at a Nazi party rally. Check out the pin on her lapel. It's a little gift from her idol. So, yes, visitors kept coming to the Third Reich, and many of them looked quite respectable. So let's assume we've dropped our bags, had a sip of tea, had some piece of Adlon cake, and went for a walk to explore the city. The first thing almost every traveler writes: unbelievably clean, not a speck of dust, spotless. That's a high-quality observation. Here is what one student wrote in his diary. The streets of Berlin are broad and clean, with neat rows of trees of identical height on either side. Makes you wonder, was it just good old German order at work? More eagle-eyed visitors would spot these super new-looking street lamps. Amazingly, how many of them survived. You can see plenty around Berlin today. They were designed personally by Hitler's pet architect, Albert Speer. Look at them. Comparing to the old ones, they look really bossy. There are hundreds of them left now, but the plan was tens of thousands, because Berlin was seriously prepping to become the capital of the world. What else can you notice? Oh yes, what people were wearing. Again, very tidy. Here is what one Australian diplomat wrote. Everywhere trousers have been neatly and firmly creased. There seems to have been a national ironing and a national haircut. And then he adds, they have taken a pull at themselves, and apparently a willing pull. Intriguing. Whose will, exactly? Even to staunch anti-fascists, it can sometimes seem as if Germany had been drowning in political chaos and economic collapse, and the Nazis, with their infamous iron will, somehow brought order to the mess. The Germans, yes, only the Germans, of course, started living the good life and kept it going right up until the war. But that's the trap. 5 years before the catastrophe in 1928, Germany's elections were won by a broad coalition of social democrats, centrists and leftists. The Nazis, they scraped together a pitiful 2.5%, but then came the crash. The Great Depression hit, and Germany began to unravel. In the early 1930s, all Western countries were suffering mass unemployment. In Germany, on the eve of Hitler's rise to power, 6 million people were out of work. And then the Nazis won the elections, riding a wave of loud promises to make Germany great again and fix everything. And they did. By our year 1936, unemployment had dropped by more than 2/3. But how exactly? And at what cost? First, they introduced mandatory labor service, essentially forced work for all. They called it the Reich Labor Service and gave it this lovely little flag, nicknamed the coffee bean. All young men between 19 and 25 were marched off into compulsory labor. Second, they launched public works projects, most famously those gleaming German autobahns. But the majority of workers earned less than they had on unemployment benefits, and quitting wasn't really an option. Add to that communal living in near prison-like barracks, with rent deducted straight from your meager pay. Third, the Nazis fired all Jews and a large number of women, thereby freeing up jobs and quietly massaging the unemployment statistics. Fourth, by 1936, all industrialized countries had started to recover and bring unemployment down, but most of them did it in the boring way, without forced labor and other efficient methods. And finally, the Nazis simply printed money and would absolutely have ended up with hyperinflation if they hadn't started a war. But then again, wasn't that the plan all along? Speaking of money, we've just arrived to Berlin 1936 and we need to exchange some. And here's the only option to do it. State-run, of course. This is the Reichsbank building on Verdische Markt. It was built in 1934, 1936, and this is one of the few surviving buildings of that time. Originally, the design competition was won by a modernist architect, Mies van der Rohe. But Hitler, of course, threw the modernist out and appointed his own guy. Now this building houses the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but we arranged to take a peek inside. After the war, GDR bureaucrats moved on, so there's not much left from the old grandeur. But there are a few traces left. Look at that. Look at that, this enormous hole that in 1936 was the cash hole. It looks like that the windows were along these walls, and behind them, just cold, hard cash. Now, let's talk money. The trick was you couldn't exchange your currency, say British pounds, into Reichsmarks at all. It simply was not an option. Travelers were not given Reichsmarks. They were given something instead called a Reisemark, special money for travelers. And the catch was you couldn't convert it into pounds back. You had to spend all of them here in Germany. The idea was pretty clear: to squeeze as much hard currency out of tourists as possible, because you just couldn't print that stuff out of thin air. Time to have lunch, but first, one little question. How to say hello? Yes, everyone knows that in Germany people say Guten Tag. But in 1930s Germany, there was this little gesture that feels so awkward to demonstrate in the streets right now. Yes, I'm talking about the Nazi salute and this cheerful Heil Hitler. Well, the Nazis didn't actually invent the salute. They took it from the Italians, who, in their turn, took it from the ancient Rome. 5 years before taking power, only hardcore party members greeted each other like that. But since 1933, a series of decrees rolled it out across the entire country. First, only party members had to greet each other like that. Then, ordinary citizens, but only when the anthem played. Then, on the national holidays. And then, it was easier to remember where you shouldn't wave your hand like that. Very quickly, they were easier to remember the rare occasions where you didn't have to throw your arm up. Spoiler, there were not too many. To the salute, they added the iconic greeting, Heil Hitler. Some jokers used to say 3 Liter, 3 liters, instead of Heil Hitler. But these jokes didn't stick on too long. Well, and what foreigners were supposed to do in the Reich? First, it was a personal matter. John Haygate, a screenwriter and director who worked with English language films at the UFA studios in Berlin, he decided to greet in the Nazi style just to avoid troubles. He once drove from Berlin to Prague, and on the country roads he greeted everyone with Nazi salute, like "Hi there, hi there, hi there." And later, he joked, his arm started to hurt. So soon he began dreaming about a turn button with a mechanical hand. You just press the button and it goes, "Hi there, hi there," and you drive by. Another traveler wrote about riding packed buses and seeing people entering the bus and the others like trying to... Another diary describes a man who was riding a bicycle, tried to greet someone and lost his balance and fell down. But as time went on, the vibe shifted. More and more foreign travelers remarked that they got this side eyes, if not worse. Sometimes the real violence occurred when they didn't want to return the salute. Some restaurants even hang signs with a reminder for the guests how to behave at the entrance. In modern Germany, the Nazi salute is a criminal offense, so I'll be walking in like a normal person. But just keep in mind that in 1936, they would have expected from me a very different kind of entrance. This is Schildkröte, the Tortoise, one of the oldest surviving restaurants in Berlin. It was established in 1936, which means that back then it would have been brand new. Also, it's kind of amazing that it's made through the entire 20th century practically untouched and lived to tell the tale. You'll see it in a second. Let's start with beer. It's also a good way to talk about money in general. This is a Seidel, an old German measure. Usually it's a mug or a glass. It doesn't have a fixed volume. In Munich, for example, it's half a liter. In Berlin, 0,3. So how much was a Seidel in 1936? Between 30 and 50 Reichspfennigs. 1 Reichsmark is approximately 5 euros today. So this beer would cost 2.30, 2.50. Now, food. A simple sausage with mustard and bread would cost you half a mark. A big plate, say pork knuckle with cabbage, would run you about 1.5. Now, let's compare to the prices today. A sausage, €3.50, so €1 more expensive than in 1936. Crispy pork knuckle, sauerkraut, potatoes, beer sauce, $21.50, which is a bit more than 4 Reichsmarks in 1936. Yeah. Now, let's compare wages. A worker earned 1828 Reichsmarks a week, so that made €500-600 per month. So a lunch at a pub like that would cost him 4 to 8% of a weekly wage. So yeah, it was cheaper to dine at home. And surprisingly, the government wanted people to do exactly that. 9 months after the Nazis came to power, on October 1st, 1933, the entire country sat down to what they called the Eintopfsonntag, one-pot Sunday. The idea was simple. Instead of having the traditional Sunday roast, a chunk of meat with potatoes, just cook one-pot dinner. A stew or porridge or mac and cheese will be way more cheap and nourishing. Instead, people were encouraged to cook a single-pot meal like this, Kartoffelsuppe, so they could donate the savings to the veterans. The propaganda turned this one-top Sunday into full culinary ideology. Museum magazines published Eintopf recipes. Entire cookbooks were published. Public Eintopf lunches were held in parks and in the streets. And more loyal newspapers published a photo of Hitler with his friends and a big pot front and center. In his speech, he was shouting himself, "Anyone who doesn't take part is a weak-willed parasite of the German people." Hard to argue with that, right? Meanwhile, on those Sundays, collectors went door to door to collect donations. And if you tried to escape this one-pot movement by going out to eat, restaurants were legally required to offer at least one discounted dish, of course, cooked in a pot. Whew, lunch. Check. Let's now have coffee, especially since the Nazis had a very special relationship with this particular drink. Back in 1936, though, coffee was a rare and precious product, and it stayed so pretty much all the way under the Nazis. Coffee even became a matter of national importance. One of the highest, top-ranked Nazi officials dedicated a whole article to coffee. This is a pre-war article written by Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda. It's titled Kaffeetanten, Coffee Aunties. Okay, you can actually guess the tone the propaganda minister takes, and he doesn't disappoint. Here, in the first lines, he admits it. Yes, there is a coffee shortage, but, and it's always interesting to see what follows the but. Coffee is a luxury item. One can easily do without it if necessary. Oh yeah, sure. And then he reassures us, it's not a question of weapons instead of coffee. But, there again, but. Long story short, if it's tank or coffee, folks, well, you get the idea. Then Joseph finds the real enemy. We've seen the queues for coffee in the cities. You know, there are people who never ever drank coffee before, and now, suddenly, they want some. Disgraceful. And to finish on a cheerful note, one foreigner recently saw people queuing and asked what they were queuing for. Potatoes. When he heard it was for coffee, he said, if coffee is your country's only problem, then your country is doing just fine. Yes, and the article is dated February the 5th, 1939, so even before the problems have started. So if Goebbels is against, I'll have another cup. Whew, all right. I've pulled myself together, and now it's time for a little museum stroll. So what kind of art could I see in 1936 Berlin? Well, for instance, there is this little exhibition running in this glorious year, the Adolf Hitler Streets in Art.
How about that? Huh? Naturally, the whole thing was staged to promote the Autobahns, and Reich artists diligently painted landscapes with the new roads, all of which, by some strange coincidence, bore the name of one and the same man.
But back in 1936, that particular exhibition runs in Schönhausen Palace, which is a bit out of town. So I'd better head to the old National Gallery, where German art stands in flesh, as it were.
Hitler tried to become an artist, which frankly only made things worse, because along with his thirst to fellowship, he thought he loved art with this particular sigh, oh, that were real masters, not that modern scribbles of today. The great German artist Caspar David Friedrich didn't seem to have made it to Hitler's personal list of favorites. Maybe that's because Hitler sensed some subversity in his art. Still, Friedrich remained firmly one of the greatest in German painting. And here where it becomes interesting. Friedrich is one of the masters of German Romanticism, and Romanticism is firmly tied with nationalism. But nationalism in pre-Napoleonic times was something completely different than later. And nationalism was something completely different from what it became later. It was bold, rebellious, and youthful. That was an idea that deeply unsettled the old powers. What? These people? They consider themselves a nation? Not just subjects of the king? That was in the 19th century. Everything has changed in the 20th one. Yet, the connection between German nationalism and German Romanticism truly exists. There was a linguist and a scholar called Victor Klemperer who miraculously survived in Nazi Germany being a Jew. So he wrote in his book, The Language of the Third Reich, Nazism could not have failed to grow out of Romanticism. It was all there. Distrust of reason, reducing man to an animal, glorifying power, reverence for the predator. Isn't it an unfair accusation? Klemperer asks himself. Didn't Romanticism also gather all the great humanist ideals? Yes, it's fair, because Nazism does not know any restraint. Every nation holds both light and darkness within, and dictators always know which side to bet on.
But if there is such thing as healthy art, especially in this Parthenon-sized temple, there must be such thing as unhealthy art. And where did the Nazis take all this unhealthy art after coming to power in 1933? Did they just turn it off like a switcher? No, they didn't. And they did give it a name, and that name sticked to the great German art of the 20th century like a bad smell. They called it degenerate art. First, their works quietly disappeared from German museums and galleries, not forgetting to fire all the directors along the way. Then the artists' names were dragged through the mud in the press. And then the grand finale. They were seized from the museums and shown on the exhibition with the sneering title Degenerate Art in Munich. The curators did their best to compose new titles like Farmers Through Jewish Eyes. The story about the Degenerate Art exhibition in Munich is well known, but that was not the end of it. Oh no! The exhibition went on tour, and the first stop was here, Berlin.
The building that hosted the exhibition hasn't survived, but here's the postcard you could have sent home as a souvenir. And that famous photo of Goebbels strutting through the halls with a commanding air? That was taken right here in Berlin. So yes, the exhibition site itself is gone, but one other object tied to this rather unseemly story still stands firmly in the city today.
This is the Victoria Warehouse. It was built back in the Kaiser's days, but under the Führer, it became a storage for 20,000 degenerate artworks confiscated from the museums. A small portion of it had made it into this educational traveling exhibitions. Here is the photo of the curator inspecting the last deposits of degeneracy before the Berlin show. And what about the rest? The rest was sold for hard currency, which was, as I said, in high demand. A small army of dealers quickly sprang up, selling out this Jewish rubbish to America and Europe. This is where all the fools are, not here, obviously. All this operation was wrapped into sort of moral math. The Jewish-led museums, for good German money, bought these monstrosities, and now they have to sell it out to get the money back into the right hands. In March 1939, the warehouse was shut down. Around 5,000 artworks were declared worthless. That happened in spring, probably before Easter, when Germans traditionally do a deep cleaning and burn all the old junk.
So, Berlin, evening now. Spears, street lamps are glowing, and what shall we do? Opera, cinema, theater, dancing, torch parade. Half a day on the move, I'm tired. Let's go with something simpler. Say, the movies.
This is the Delphi Cinema, opened in 1929, purpose-built for sound. Sound in the movies. That was the high tech of the 30s. So, what could one have caught on screen here in spring of 1936?
Of course, it may seem that screens in the Third Reich were showing nothing but drive off the wheel. That's Leni Riefenstahl's film shot at the 1934 Nuremberg Party Congress. 35 cameramen, 120 kilometers of raw footage, a cinematic spectacle of epic proportions. Later, Riefenstahl insisted, this is a historical film, not propaganda. It reflects the truth of life in 1934. Sure. And this historical reportage ends like this. Rudolf Hess shouts,
Die Partei ist Hitler!
the party is Hitler, but Hitler is Germany, just as Germany is Hitler. And then comes the party anthem.
Yes, the Nazis did produce a mountain of propagandist nonsense. But it was not the majority. If you look up the stats, you'll see that only 10% of German movies were overtly political. The rest, 41% were dramas and 49% were comedies. Yes, life in the Third Reich was a laughing stuff if you went by the movies. Now, how do we have such precise stats that just happen to line up along the goals of Nazi leadership? Just 6 months after the Nazis came to power, they established the Reich's Film Chamber, supposedly to support the industry during the crisis. Every single filmmaker had to be a member. Money flowed in through this union of filmmakers, and then the favorite dictatorship song began. Who pays for the movie gets to choose the plot. The UFA studio was nationalized and everything was set under control.
Let's take a closer look at those comedies. Yes, of course, they were anti-Semitic ones with caricatured Jews, just like this one, Robert and Bertram. Two friends head to Berlin to rob a wealthy Jew, and here's your happy ending.
Geben Sie schon her den Giftschrank.
Zionismus, was Sie haben.
Vermutlich meinen Sie Zynismus.
Nur wie man's nimmt.
But overall, such films were few. The bulk of them were just silly little throwaway comedies, pure mass-market fluff. Sure, before the Nazis, films like that were made in Germany too, as everywhere. But in the 1920s, Germany also produced great films, masterpieces that still make up the glory of world cinema. And once the film industry was locked inside the Reich film chamber, all that was left was this. Oh, cartoons were no exception. Just like everywhere else, Germany loved Mickey Mouse and the whole Disney gang. Even the censors had to give in and allow the famous Silly Symphony series onto German screens. Some cartoons didn't even need persuading, like the Three Little Pigs, for example. In its later edit, it looked like this, but in the original 1933 version, it looked like this. No one knows exactly what the creators meant by it, but the officials in Berlin, they loved it.
Still, the Disney supply gradually dried up thanks to the Nazis' slapping of input duties on foreign films. In 1937, Disney's major distribution deal with UFA ended, and Mickey became so rare that Goebbels gifted Hitler 18 Mickey Mouse movies for Christmas that year. The Führer over the moon. Ooh, what a day! Passport control. Check. Checked into the Adlon. Yes. Swapped in some Reichsmarks. Grabbed a bite. Then coffee. Then a museum. And then the cinema. Couldn't pick a film. Too many options. Whew. Now, sleep. Tomorrow I'll try to be more active. Sports and dancing on the agenda. Gute Nacht. So what music greets us on our second morning in 1936? There is another common misconception that the Third Reich sounded like one endless loop of Wagner, Horst-Wessel-Lied and military marches. Not quite. More often, it was sweet little tunes with folksy motifs. And yes, in Nazi Germany, jazz was considered black music for second-class people. But if you can't beat it, lead it. The Reich had its own jazz. Well, almost jazz. We'll get to that this evening. For now, time to get up. There were no gyms in grand hotels back then, so if you wanted a bit of exercise, you had to go somewhere. And we are headed to somewhere quite special, a small miracle that somehow survived in modern-day Berlin. On the way, let's talk about why the Nazis were obsessed with sports, physical fitness and the cult of the body. Where I live, there is a saying, the English invented sport, the Germans invented physical education. And the 1930s Germans loved both. The mass promotion of physical culture wasn't about public health. Not really. It was about forging the nation into a single obedient fist. Even the early SA, the Nazi stormtroopers, originally posed as a sports club, not a paramilitary squad. Once in power, the Nazis rolled out all sorts of physical benchmarks. The most influential group? An organization with a suspiciously cheerful name, Strength Through Joy. The largest tour operator in Nazi Germany, sending citizens on holiday trips across the Reich and Europe, while also organizing massive public sporting events. Long story short, physical activity was ramped up and for many it became mandatory and daily. And meanwhile, here we are at a very unusual place. The building looks a little bit battered, but that makes it even more promising. That means that the building has been somewhere in the past and now made it to the present. And we are going inside. Here it looks a bit shabby, but just in a few meters we can see this in all its old, faded glory, the Stadtbad, or the bathhouse. It's a typical German invention. Well, not only German, it was in the spirit of all German and former German-speaking countries. You can find bathhouses like this in places from Prague to Cologne. A vast swimming pool, but also saunas, hot tub, cold tub, the full aquatic symphony. But it's not only for hygiene. These bathhouses were the temples of public health. In 1936, the Nazis score a PR victory. The Olympic Games come to Berlin. If we imagine ourselves here in the spring of 1936, the Games are still a few months away. But that gives us time to hop over and check out the main stadium, appropriately named Olympiastadion. A lot of it still stands heavy as ever. And on the way there, let's talk about the Olympic Games themselves. The Games were awarded to Berlin back in 1931, a full 2 years before the Nazis came to power. They had absolutely nothing to do with this victory of the German people. Berlin beat out a long list of competitors, from Alexandria to Helsinki, and when it came down to Berlin versus Barcelona in the final round, the IOC had one more reason to go with Germany. The 1916 Games had been planned for Berlin too, but were cancelled due to the First World War. And surely there couldn't possibly be another World War, right? To outshine the rather lavish Los Angeles Games in 1932, Hitler went all in. He launched construction of a 100,000-seat stadium, bought equipment for the world's first live television broadcast, and then brought in Leni Riefenstahl. Yes, her. with an enormous budget to film Olympia. And even, brace yourselves, agreed to remove anti-Semitic propaganda from the streets of Berlin during the Olympics. But all that comes later.
And this is the Holy of the Holiest, the stadium itself. It was set halfway into the ground, so when you enter, you arrive right in the middle of the tiers of the stand, and you're smack in the center of a roaring crowd of 100,000. The stadium was designed by Werner March, and it was built on the site of another stadium, the German stadium, Deutsches Stadion, that had been designed by the father of Werner, Otto March. Blood and soil. On opening day, the teams will march through there, none of them boycotting the games. Some will even adopt the new way to greet the leadership. The leadership, by the way, will sit there with the little balcony where Hitler will appear to bless the faithful. He didn't wave like everyone else, he did like that. Icon-like. The balcony was later carefully sawed off. Didn't change much the appearance of the stadium, but made the vibe just a little more pleasant. The Olympic Park is a strange sight. It was meant to be a grand showcase of physical culture and athletic triumph, and yet Berliners have made it their own. They rent out football pitches, they walk their dogs, they ride their bikes, and yet few relics of that era still linger, like this house of German sport, or these sculptures, heroic-looking ones, or this eagle carved into stone, like it had been here all the time, the favorite Nazis' word. Eternal. In the eagle's talons, an oak wreath of victory, but the eye can't help but imagine, right in the middle of the circle, one all too familiar symbol. It was here until 1945.
Well then, where at the stadiums, there's fast food. But for the most Berlin kind of fast food, we'll need to take a little detour.
No tourist guide is complete without street food. It's an essential part of city life, and there is no Berlin without döners and currywursts. I found a sausage stand that was already here in 1936. This one, Max Konnopke, opened this kiosk in 1930. Sausages were sold on German city corners since the 19th century. This one is a true survivor. It's here under its fourth regime. Could Max Konnopke, sausage maker and vendor, live his peaceful, quiet life under sweeping changes in Germany? In 1933, he was selling sausages at a Nazi party rally in Nuremberg. Then, in 1939, due to meat shortages, he replaced sausages with potato fritters, and in 1941, he was sent to the front.
I know, I got a bit carried away with the fast food, but Herr Konnopke doesn't have what I really wanted to wash it down with.
This is Mustafa, one of the most popular Berlin kebabs and döners. And this is one of the sponsors of the 1936 Olympics, Coca-Cola. The American company Coca-Cola in the 1930s was making a big push to Germany, and that made sense. Production was convenient and easy, and being in the heart of Europe made distribution way easier. So by the late 1930s, Coca-Cola had 43 German bottling plants and 600 distributors. The head of Coca-Cola, Max Kite, was not exactly a Nazi lover. He was rather just fine under any regime. The problem started in 1940 during the war, when Americans cut off Coca-Cola syrup made under, as you know, a secret formula. That made the Germans in a bit of a fizz. Supplies were running low and they had to improvise. So they invented a new drink using whatever was available: milk whey and apple fibers. The result was a sweetish, vaguely fruity drink called Fantasie, or, to keep things snappy, Fanta. Now, let's have a walk and talk about slightly grander fantasies. Of course, the city is being Nazified. Check out this rare artifact still hanging over Charlottenburg. But this is not all. The fantasies should be really grand. So how about a huge city, a Welthauptstadt, so a world capital, named modestly Germania? It only sounds less ridiculous in German because in German, Deutschland is the name for the country and Germania is the concept.
The dream! So yes, Hitler decided to design a new capital and to build it over Berlin. Honestly, he was never fond of the old Prussian capital. Too much of a free-spirited vibe, too many memories about the roaring 20s and too many good inappropriate jokes. And this is how Albert Speer, Hitler's favorite architect, looked like. Very cozy, right? No. Huge avenues, boulevards wide enough to land a plane, and in the very heart of it, Volkshalle, the People's Hall, 320 meters across and able to fit 180,000 very enthusiastic citizens. And of course, no Germania can be without a huge, beautiful, triumphal arch to celebrate glorious victories from Siberia to London. Before building such a monster, they had to check though whether Berlin's sandy soil will handle such a magnificence. So right in northwest Berlin, they built something called the Schwerbelastungskörper. These are 22 letters of pure German poetry. It translates as heavy load exerting body. These little holes were drilled to a lower level to check if the ground had sunk unto 14 meters high above ground and 18 meters below. So the arch would have stood proud, no problem. But by 1943, other kinds of problems had started and the project was quietly shelved. The Schwerbelastungskörper, however, remained a strange, solitary lump of Nazi ambition, still pressing down on Berlin.
And the Reichstag, once destined to become just an annex to the 200,000-seat Hall of the People, still stands.
The Reichstag, Germany's parliament, by 1936 had become not a symbol of German parliamentarism, but of the opposite. The infamous Reichstag's fire had become one of the last steps towards total domination of the Nazis. They blamed it on the communists, on the left, on the liberals, and used it as a pretext to seize absolute power in the country. And so for the years that followed, the 1930s, the early 40s, the Reichstag became nothing. It just stood here without any function. In 1945, it was declared a new symbolic target for the Red Army, and it turned it into rubble. Then came more years of silence and neglect, until finally enter the new Norman Foster's Dome, transparent and beautiful, a shining symbol of new Germany stitched together according to a very different pattern. The Reich Aviation Ministry have survived the bombings of World War II. However, I wonder where should the Allied Air Force have aimed, if not the Nazi Air Force. But it stood its ground, and that's what basically the Nazi style is about. Just standard neoclassicism, slightly deranged, pompous to the parody, utterly inhuman, but I've seen it all before. Yes, 2,000 offices with identical little windows, marble floors with swastikas and monuments to Germany's flying heroes. If they had they survived, it would have been more exotic, but they hadn't. Later on, the GDR constitution was symbolically signed in this very building, and now it's just the Ministry of Finance. Funny, right? From Luftwaffe to ledger books. German architecture could have taken a completely different path if not for, well, you know. Take this church at Hohenzollernplatz. It was completed, tragically, ironically, in 1933. What would Nazis do with it? Tear it down? Thankfully, they didn't. Just look at this beauty. 13 pointed arches. And from the outside, it's even more striking. And from the outside, it's a striking expressionist building with this avant-garde form. And most of all, this portal that looks like an organ calling you to prayer. This is what Germany of the 1930s could have been. A country of visionary artists, architects, dreamers. But all these people, under the new regime, had no place. The architect of this church, Osip Klarwein, the native of the Russian Empire, was very quick to understand the direction where things were heading. In 1934, he left Germany for good. And now for souvenirs. What shall I bring back from Nazi Berlin? Something for family, something for friends. Souvenirs. What can you buy in Berlin today? Beer mugs, coffee mugs, pens, bags, glasses, magnets, postcards. But what about in 1936? The imagination whispers all kinds of horrific fantasies. Swastika toys, little figurines of Nazi officials, board games with eagles. But the problem is, this is exactly how it was. Shopkeepers and petit bourgeois, the prime supporters of National Socialist Party, immediately came up with 1,000 ideas how to cash in on the new idols. So here are the actual souvenirs sold in the Reich immediately after the Nazis' rise to power. Little stormtrooper figurines, cufflinks, egg cups, saucers, matches, fans, music boxes that play the host vessel song, even puzzles where the goal was to arrange the letters of the great leader's name in the right order. A Soviet writer, Ilya Ehrenberg, writes from the Tsar region just before its Christmas season annexation into the Reich. Mothers and fathers, hurry up! Little Booby wants a Christmas tree with a real chancellor made of real elastilin. And right there, in a butcher's shop window, a fascist cross made entirely of sausages. In 1933, the government rushed in to pass a law protecting the national symbols and banning frivolous trinkets. But the official merchandise still flourished. Nazi uniforms, ceremonial daggers, and endless editions of Mein Kampf. Swing Heil. No, it's not a dumb joke. It was an actual greeting used by teenagers and young people in Nazi Germany who were not swept away by the mass cults. Swing was the hottest music of the 1930s and the most hated by the Nazis, because it was both black and Jewish. Swing fans didn't dress like everyone else. They wore long coats, baggy jackets, loud ties, and for the girls, bright makeup. Basically pre-war hipsters. Ironically, they called themselves Swing Jugend, Swing Youth. And yes, as I told, they greeted each other accordingly. At some point, the authorities gave up. They created their own state-approved and state-controlled swing band. It was called Charlie and the Orchestra, and it sounded just like any other jazz orchestra in the world. But the lyrics... Here's Charlie's song, a bit later than 36, but the message is exactly the same.
The Pacific. The Japanese are in the big news. They fight aggression in the Pacific. They fight Roosevelt and his Jews.
Hard to feel like swinging to that kind of swing, and yet the pressing question remains. How do you meet a girl in Nazi Berlin? At a disco, of course. Welcome to Delphi Club, the Mecca of Swing, as it was named. It has earned this title before the Nazi came to power and reclaimed it for one single glorious year, 1936. Right before and during the Olympics, Berlin put on the face of international city and pretended to be the city where all kinds of music, even the racially unworthy, could exist. But here is the question: could you actually meet a girl at these parties? And take it further. That brings us to a bigger question. What was the woman in the Reich? Exactly. Before the Nazis, Germany was the world leader among women's parliamentary representation. Under the Nazis, not a single woman in the leadership. It was boys-only club, through and through. And like any good boys' club, it made sure that women knew their place. The official social program for women was reduced to 3K. Kinder, Küche, Kirche. Children, kitchen, church. Women's university admissions were slashed to just 10%. Unmarried women were downgraded to second-class citizens, just like mentally unfit. Even smoking in public was off-limit for women. The stormtroopers would snatch a cigarette from your mouth and scold you for insulting the Führer. Then came the tricky question of premarital relations. On one hand, a clear sign of moral decay. On the other hand, not all premarital relations are equal. If such a relation produces a racially pure baby, such a relation should be encouraged, because more babies, more soldiers. In 1935, they launched the Lebensborn program, a state-based program to encourage racially pure mothers and raise their Aryan kids. If a single mother would prove that the father of her child has the right nose, blue eyes and a good job in SS, she would be entitled to full state support. So meeting someone at a swing night, at least for me, would have been complicated. But one thing was easy: spotting a blonde. Ever since the Nazis came to power, Germany has got way more blonder. In a single 1934, 10 million boxes of light hair dye were sold.
The last dance you'd actually want to be at. Not exactly a cheerful thought, dancing in a room full of blonde people completely indifferent to your existence. Simulating SS membership isn't easy, after all. And let's be honest, no one wants to catch themselves mid-dance to some charming little tune about Roosevelt and his friends. Alright, time to come up with a different kind of entertainment.
Let's go to the theater tonight. This is Konzerthaus, the concert hall built over 200 years ago by the great German romantic artist and architect Karl Schinkel. During the Nazi years, it was called the Prussian State Theater, the place to see the great German culture in action. Its artistic director was Gustav Gründgens, a phenomenally talented actor who was playing Mephistopheles in Faust when Nazis came to power, and he caught an eye of Hermann Göring, not only the Reichsstatthalter, the official governor of Prussia, but also the protector, the political boss of the theater. This was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Gründgens was appointed an artistic director, and his entire career unfolded to a very strange soundtrack of this very strange relationship between a gay actor and the Nazi leadership. His colleagues were stunned. They asked, "Gustav, what the hell are you doing? You're sitting in one room with them." But he responded, "I serve the theater, not the regime." But for the artistic director of a state theater, these two were very hard to separate. In 1936, Gründgens played Hamlet on this very stage, and he was stunning. But in the new regime, the question to be or not to be already had an answer. Jedem das seine, to each his own. Day 2 had a very particular flavor. Swing, both forbidden American and officially approved German. Sports, both personal and total. Architecture, from lampposts to world capitals. And dancing, still it's not clear with whom. Tomorrow I'll try to watch the locals more closely. Gute Nacht.
Soldaten gut und dachten nur an sie spät und früh und kam mit hellem Schein daran das Land heranmarschiert.
After winning the election and clearing out all the political competition, the Nazis faced a new challenge: converting the society of voters and citizens into unquestioning, obedient mass. Newspapers were fine, but they only worked for people who actually could read. Radio was way more powerful. It could talk, shout, and sing. The Berlin radio house had been already built in 1931, but when the Nazis seized the power, they got to work. Personal radios were still luxury at the time, so they did have a clever idea. They released a Volksempfänger, or people's receiver, so everyone could listen to party's broadcast. But here was the twist. These radios were designed only to receive regional and local stations, and nothing from abroad, as if foreign stations simply didn't exist. Pretty soon Germany had more radios per capita than any other country in Europe. At first, Nazi radio was old politics, but very soon people started to get sick of constant political lullabies. So the regime pivoted. In 1936, 2/3 of the airtime was all music, and not the highbrow kind. A solid 6/7 of it was popular music, not classical. Later, Albert Speer summed it up. This is how 80 million of people lost their ability to think for themselves. For the 80% who didn't listen to the radio, there were always the newspapers. The Nazi truth was handled by Völkische Beobachter, the People's Observer. By the start of the war, its circulation had grown to 1.2 million. Every civil servant, every party member, even school teachers subscribed. Just in case a student copied something from it in their essay, you wouldn't want to mark the wrong sentence in red. That could get awkward. Then there was Der Stürmer, the Stormtrooper, a more radical newspaper read by the truly unhinged. This front page had carried the slogan, "The Jews are our misfortune." But of course there were also papers that tried to look liberal against all odds. The most famous was Frankfurter Zeitung, the Frankfurt newspaper. It became a kind of shelter for undesirable political elements, social democrats, liberals, even Catholics. Up until 1938, they even kept the name of their Jewish founder, Leopold Sonnemann, in their masthead. And no one batted an eye. They even got away with running pseudo-historical pieces about Genghis Khan, subtly hinting that he reminded them of you-know-who. The paper would only be shut down during the war. And here is a paper that would keep going right up to the bitter end. Novaya Slovo, the new word. The only Russian-language Nazi paper, naturally bankrolled directly by Goebbels. Reading it in Russian, especially in pre-revolutionary spelling, is surreal. The word Führer is capitalized, of course, and even the pronoun, as if referring to God. Here is a piece about a new monument shaped like a swastika, and it mentions Russian blood in full caps, naturally. Here is an article titled Source of Panic, about those loudmouths who were predicting a German invasion of Bulgaria and France. What nonsense, right? And what's more interesting in the everyday life of the Russian emigre community in the Reich, Hitler and Rosenberg's speeches published as collectible pamphlets, the bestseller Bolshevism and Jewry, and of course, restaurants, cigarettes, vodka, and peppermint gingerbread. Alright then, from the press, let's move on to serious literature. And what about books in the Reich of 1936? Well, many still remember the chilling image of what was happening behind the opera at the Opernplatz in 1933, a bonfire of books as part of the action against the un-German spirit. One might think that the Nazis made a habit of this pagan festival of book burning right until the bitter end. But in fact it was just a little short affair, just a few months in 1933. By 1936, the un-German spirit was gone. Today on the square in front of the opera there is a memorial by an Israeli artist Micha Ullman. The empty library, shelves and shelves, absolutely empty, descending into the earth. The flaming mountains of books and public squares made for great photo ops and newsreel footage, but what was the reality of literature in the Reich? Right after the Nazis came to power, Germany's best writers left the country. Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, Leon Feuchtwanger and others. They traveled the world, gave lectures, published abroad. But that was the exiled crowd. What about the ones who stayed? As usual, in these situations, what was offered to them was the Aesopian dialect of the German language. In 1935, Werner Bergergruen published a novel titled The Great Tyrant and Judgment. Bergergruen publicly denied any and all parallels, and the book, it got published. In fact, it became a bestseller. But that was more of an exception. The censorship machine operated with no real logic. Charles Dickens and Walter Scott were banned, while John Steinbeck was allowed. And Gone with the Wind sold 300,000 copies. In short, it all depended on your luck. Now then, let's talk about the readers. Let's take a look at how ordinary Berliners lived. Not journalists, not writers, not party members, just everyday people keeping their heads down and staying out of trouble. In 1936, the housing complex Grazer Damm didn't exist yet, but it was coming soon, and its name, Graz, was very much in the spirit of the times. Actually, the city of Graz is in Austria, but since Austria was annexed by Germany, Graz became the German city too. And so in honor of these shiny new territories, developers rushed to name new buildings accordingly. Here you can still find the mosaic with the city Graz coat of arms, even despite of city of Graz, has long since returned to its actual homeland. Grazer Dam is the largest completed residential complex built during the Nazi era in Berlin. Very rare. 2,000 flats, mostly for workers, beautifully decorated with bas-reliefs of fairy tales, men, women, and this wonderful pioneer from Hitler-Jugend. Look at him. Even the layout follows the logic of the times. It was designed to shield the block from air raids, diverting blast pressure in case of bombings and preventing draft in case of fires. How did the Nazis know that the war was coming? You might get the impression that life of ordinary Germans who were not gay, communists or Jewish was calm and comfortable. But it wasn't. The National Socialism wrapped the entire population with the net of fear. Every neighborhood had a Kreisleiter, a party overseer who did a watch over the district. And every building, just like that one, had a Hauswart, who most probably was a snitch. For saying anything that might seem just little subversive, one should produce a look around called the German glance. People were joking that they must greet themselves not with German salute, but with German glance, just to be sure that nobody's listening.
Denunciation was everywhere. One historian randomly selected 825 investigations from a single Gestapo office, covering the entire period from 1933 to 1945. A quarter of those cases were opened based on tips from ordinary citizens. And here is another analysis. A different historian examined 213 individual denunciations. Of those, 37% were rooted in personal conflicts, another 39 had no clear motive at all, and only 24 could definitely be attributed to the loyalty to the regime.
Would I have been able to chat with people closely, just meeting them here in the courtyard? Not very likely. I should have spoken German and listened closely. Some people gave their children ancient Germanic names like Baldo, Horst, or even Siegland. Some would say, yes, we're sliding into darkness, but still. Some would casually drop words like the Brown Army or Weltjuden, the World Jewry, or even liquidate instead of to kill.
From the very beginning, the Nazi regime worked hard to create the illusion that the entire German people supported it. To do this, the country was constantly holding plebiscites, referendums on all the most important national questions. Every single one of them choreographed by the Ministry of Propaganda. In that very same year, 1936, the one I've chosen for my little journey, Reichstag elections were held. Here is the ballot, and no, there aren't any other candidates, no strategic voting. There isn't even a box for no. 99% voter turnout, 99% in favor. The rest simply invalid. Spoiling your ballot was the only form of protest left. From Hitler's very first year in power, his birthday became a national holiday. By year 4, public life had become one endless ritual. Foreigners would arrive stunned, and only the clever ones understood. It worked. As American journalist William Sherry put it, Hitler is restoring pageantry and color and mysticism to the drab lives of 20th century Germans. Which brings up a question.
What if back in 1936 you wanted something truly exotic? Some Nazi mass event like torchlit parade or anything else, just some real spectacle. On this place, back then, stood Berlin Sportpalast, a huge venue built back in 1910 and able to fit as much as 14,000 people. So, of course, the Nazis were absolutely crazy about it. Of course they were, because they could cram in a lot of people, keep everyone warm, keep the torches, and just do this. Goebbels gently referred to this palast as our tribune. These mass events made huge impression on foreign guests. And of course, you can imagine they were perfectly directed, dripping in black and red, and thousands of people screaming.
Heil! Heil! Heil!
But not every event at the Sportpalast was for Nazi lovers. In 1934, the venue hosted the World Baptist Congress. Yes, a religious event under swastikas. And here is what one of the participants later wrote. Clearly, a leader who doesn't smoke or drink and wants women to dress modestly can't be all bad. Another visitor, a Baptist preacher called Michael King, was so impressed that he came home and changed the name of his 5-year-old son, who previously was Michael King Jr., and his new name became Martin Luther. Martin Luther King. In the middle of the war, the Sportpalast got a new neighbor, this guy right here, a military bunker. Its location made a perfect sense, especially considering that it was in the Sportpalast where Goebbels delivered his infamous speech about the total war in 1943 after the disaster at Stalingrad. The bunker was never finished. History, as they say, had other plans.
But the main tool of indoctrination was language. Yes, the usual flood of military and sports terms, headlines like Battle for the Harvest or cigarettes called War Sport. But what's far more interesting, and this was precisely what the linguist Victor Klemperer studied, is how certain words, once rare or specific, began creeping into everyday speech. Fanatical, historic, total. And then came the newly coined ones: Aryanization, de-Jewification, massification. There was no escaping these words, especially not for those at whom one particular term was aimed. Want to mention.
A Jewish woman walks into a hair salon and they refuse to cut her hair. She asks, "Why?" And the hairdresser replies, "As you know, madam, we, National Socialists, declared a boycott against the Jews. But don't believe all those rumors being spread about horrible things happening. The Führer himself promised that here in Germany, not a single hair will fall from the Jew's head." This is one of the jokes of the early years of Nazi rule. Of course, they came to power waving anti-Semitic banners. They are the ones we need to blame. But until Kristallnacht in 1938, there were no pogroms, no mass killings. Jewish life in Germany just went on with a constant background of new laws. Each one of them made their life worse and worse.
For all of this, the Nazis came up with brilliant legal formulas. Take, for instance, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service. Under the Democrats, the country had supposedly fallen apart, and here we are, restoring it. And under this new law, members of the previous government, communists and non-Aryans could no longer hold any official post. And on top of that, health regulations were rolled out. Jewish doctors were barred from treating non-Jewish patients, and visits to them were not covered by insurance. Then came the Nuremberg laws of 1935, including the so-called Law on German Citizenship, which stripped Jews of citizenship rights altogether. Legal, businesslike and impeccably phrased, all the better to mask what was really going on.
What was the language they used? Brilliantly legalese. For example, Law of the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service. Sounds nice, right? So the previous government wrecked the country and now we are restoring the order. But now, under the new rules, civil servants must not be supporters of the previous regime, communists and, surprise, non-Aryans. Then there was the National Health Service Law that ensured that your insurance would not cover your visit to a Jewish doctor. And then the Denaturalization Act that quietly stripped Jews of German citizenship. The bureaucratic language of the Third Reich was very professional, very nice, and very businesslike. And meanwhile, visible Jewish life was still ticking. The Union of Jews of Germany, the functioning synagogue, even the Jewish museum next door to it. Tourists coming to Reich saw only the surface. They saw anti-Semitic posters. They saw signs reading "Jews are not welcome." They saw puppets of greedy moneylenders parading at carnivals. So they went home saying that here, yes, they may be overdoing it a little bit, but still. And all the while, the catastrophe was coming, slowly, like a summer storm. This building here was built in the 19th century as a museum of decorative arts. After the First World War, it was transformed into a museum of prehistory, and in 1936, I would have found it exactly as it is now. Next to it, right behind what was once the Berlin Wall, stood an extension. A grand neo-Baroque building, an extension of the same museum. By the 1920s, the museum had moved out and the entire building was taken over by a library, with the rest of space taken over by the offices. After the Nazis came to power, the building was occupied by the Gestapo, and by the summer of the same year, the building's basement had been converted into a prison, where people were interrogated and tortured. Berlin in 1936 is starting to feel more and more joyless, but the city itself is still green, and the countryside around it still beautiful. Get out of town for a bit. Clear my head. Wannsee has always been a perfect day trip destination from Berlin. Take a look. A clean lake, long beach, yachts, lounge chairs, sun umbrellas. Wonderful, but this is not only us who liked it. That area was called Schwanenwerder, Swan's Island. In the villas bought for pennies from Jewish owners lived Albert Speer, Hitler's personal doctor Theo Morel, and Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda. And this villa, back to the 1930s, belonged to the industrialist Friedrich Min. He would soon sell this villa to the SS-affiliated foundation, and it will host on the 20th January 1942 the Wannsee Conference. The word conference sounds grand, but it was just a meeting between the government officials and the SS representatives. And they decided here, that is it. The final solution of the Jewish question. And what they decided was, that's all, folks. The final solution of the Jewish question. In other words, the full-scale Holocaust. This would happen in 1942. In 1936, things were still relatively quiet. But if you go looking for 1936 in Berlin's suburbs, sooner or later you come across the traces of that solution. Grunewald is one of the most picturesque and tranquil suburbs of Berlin. The streets are quiet, lined with villas ranged from mildly bourgeois to full-on aristocratic. Back in the Middle Ages, Grunewald was a royal hunting ground, so until now, Grunewald is hectares of enchanted fairy tale forest. But I suspect that, walking in the forest, had I sneaked to this cottage settlement in 1936, and pointed my phone in 1936 at one of these cottages, a dull shadow, a figure might have emerged from behind of these pines, and a conversation would have started. Because this was a friendly little settlement built especially for the members of the headquarters of SS in Berlin, supervised personally by Himmler. Alright, back to Berlin. Even Grunewald station is beautiful, a proper architectural gem. Trains still run there, behind the trees. And the first thing you see when you enter the railway station is platform 17, a very different kind of monument, something that Grunewald will stand for in the 20th century. From this platform, from 1941 to 1945, 50,000 Berlin Jews were deported to concentration camps. And this is something to say goodbye to everyone who spent their day wandering around fairy tale woods of Grunewald. The day felt scrambled and bleak. Wannsee, Grunewald, and especially the last stop. I don't think I belong to this city, to this year. Good thing I'm going home tomorrow. Good night. We all know how even the most horrifying reality can be dressed up to face the street. The display window mesmerizes. But how many people truly want to look past the window and see reality as it is? 1930s Germany remained a widely popular tourist destination for Europeans and Americans alike. And most visitors simply shrugged when the conversation turned to, well, you know, that. We weren't interested in politics, they said. And the people seemed, as locals always do to tourists, friendly. charming, but I don't believe that the common reality was unnoticeable. You could force yourself not to notice it. You could force yourself not to talk about it. You could try not to think. But reality breaks through the spell of language. It grows around us. It claims what it's owed. And soon, just like the ideology we tried to understand from within, it takes over all the Lebensraum it's been given. This was Berlin in 1936, the last year it showed the world its normal face, before beginning its descent into hell. And what became of all those we encountered on this brief journey into 1936? The propaganda swing band Charlie and his orchestra naturally ceased to exist in 1944. Its founder, Charlie himself, Karl Schwedler, stayed in Berlin. What happened next is unclear. Some say he moved to America and disappeared into obscurity. Others claim he returned to Bavaria as a pensioner and died there in the 70s. Actor and artistic director of the Prussian State Theatre, Gustav Gründgens, remained a star right up to the end of the war, and then was arrested by Soviet forces. After 9 months in detention, he was released, thanks to appeals from colleagues, from whom Gründgens himself was once spoken up before Göring. But even during the Nazi years, he was haunted by a novel published in that very same year, 1936, Mephisto. It told the story of a once talented actor destroying himself by merging with power. The novel was written by Gründgens' former lover and brilliant writer Klaus Mann, and in 1981 it was adapted, with great fanfare, by István Szabó. Gründgens never got to see the full legacy of his fictional self. He died of a sleeping pill overdose in 1963. Leni Riefenstahl, director of Triumph of the Will and Olympia, lived a long life. She was arrested immediately after the war, but no concrete evidence was ever found of her awareness of the regime's crimes. In the 1960s, she traveled extensively in Africa, filming local tribes. Riefenstahl became the first foreigner ever to receive a Sudanese passport. Until her death, she insisted she had simply been one of millions swept up by Nazi propaganda, and she believed in Hitler, saw only the good, and had no idea about the bad. But in 2024, a documentary film was released. Its authors, after reviewing 700 boxes of archival material, were able to prove that Riefenstahl had known about the mass killings carried out by the National Socialist regime from the very beginning. The artists, once branded as degenerates, have reclaimed their fame and in many cases multiplied it. Almost every year, somewhere in the world, an exhibition opens dedicated to these independent creators once denounced and blacklisted by the Nazis. The latest was in Paris at the Picasso Museum. Among the works on display were sculptures by so-called degenerate artists discovered in 2010 during construction of the Berlin subway. So the story of lost names being restored continues. The architect Osip, now Josef Klarwein, fled Nazi Germany for Palestine, where his career truly took off. After the founding of the State of Israel, he went on to design railway and bus stations, the tomb of Theodor Herzl, and the building of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. Speer's grand plan to turn Berlin into the world capital Germania fizzled out into nothing, though the monumental architect kept burning with the fire of total redesign right to the end. Meanwhile, people still live in the big housing estate on Grazer Dam. It's still called that, even though Graz is once again a city in independent Austria. The little settlement once built for Himmler's inner circle is also still a nice place to live in. As for those who used to own these little lovely villas, that's not something people here like to share. This is the Berlin Memorial, an enormous monument dedicated to all the European Jews murdered by the Nazi regime. What you see actually is a vast field with a sunken path and nearly 3,000 of grey concrete slabs, a very powerful metaphor for the cold, systematic machinery of mass murder. But just a few steps away stands the very Hotel Adlon, once home to Berlin's distinguished guests of the 1930s. Its main facade, as you remember, faces the Brandenburg Gate, but of course there is always the option of seeing the city from the other side. Now, in 2025, I come behind the wall to visit the ruins of what once was the museum and then the Gestapo prison. The building was bombed in 1945, then demolished, and it wasn't until 1980s when archaeologists uncovered what was once Gestapo prison cells. And on that excavation site, there is now Topography of Terror, the permanent exhibition explaining why this place will never be built over again. I would like to say something in the end. I really love this game, and I often play it alone in my head. I travel to the past of different cities and I imagine what my life might have been like just for a few days as an ordinary tourist. This time I did it together with you, and I peered inside one of the most horrific totalitarian regimes in the world's history. No other, and let me repeat, no other chapter in human history draws as much attention and fascination. Even now, though this year marks 80 years since the country named the Third Reich disappeared forever, evil is charming, contagious, hypnotic, and Nazi Germany has this allure for neo-Nazis, far-right politicians, conspiracy theory lovers, even the cynical sellers of Nazi memorabilia online. At the same time, Nazi Germany is a horror story, and there is a canon surrounding this horror story. And attacking this canon may be seen as an attack on another cult, the cult of condemnation. Even in small things, swastikas are blurred on TV screen, as well as children's faces, and so on. There are endless books about Nazi Germany, endless documentaries, endless feature films, constant comparisons to today's bleak and horrible realities, and political arguments that can't help but naming Hitler on the second minute. But to me, the most important aspect of this horrifying story is the daily life, just like yours or mine. The daily life in the middle of disaster, the daily choices, the fight against circumstances, the ability and inability to tell right from wrong. Historical memory keeps the moral compass from going wrong, and points of reference like Nazi Berlin help navigating the needle. And where you go from here is definitely only up to you.